So I am, as Mike said, going to take us to slightly different terrain than at least the talks that I've been here for. So I'm talking about what personalized medicine is in our heads and in our world today. My enduring interests are in the intersection between democracy, political order, science, and technology. And many people would say that they're in crisis at the moment. And it's going to be all that I can do not to talk about the Paris Accords or the California vote on single-payer healthcare tonight. So I'm going to try not to talk about either of those two things. Okay, so personalized medicine as an expression suggests something absolutely incredible. It suggests a medical revolution that's tailored to the biological and social specificity of each of our bodies and lives. It suggests bringing together everything about us that makes us unique, and the benefits of that are so clear. It's so clear what we stand to gain from this. Much more accurate diagnoses. We've had a long history of problems with misdiagnoses. Better cures, fewer side effects, care for rare disease patients, drug interaction prediction, and mitigation of personal and social care and expense burdens, and so on and so forth. So the appeal of personalized medicine is overwhelming, and it seems kind of churlish to even say, well, then what's missing, given how compelling it is to enter into this revolution. In particular, when you start asking about putting the social back into personalized medicine, the kinds of questions that I get very often are, well, what all you're doing is opening us up to more regulation. And what more regulation means is slowing down promising science and technology. And the last thing we need, especially for patients in crisis, is anything that slows us down. The other kind of question or pushback that we'll often get is that it's easy to be critical. It's easy to look at something and say, oh, this is missing or that's missing. But how do you then jump into that space of what you're saying needs to be there and do something about it? How do you make innovation in that space? And so I'm starting from taking those two comments very much on board. Nonetheless, I do want to focus this afternoon on putting the social back into personalized medicine. One of the problems with this topic of putting the social back into personalized medicine is that the equivalent word, as people often point out, seems to be socialized medicine. And that expression is already taken and means something quite different. It means universal health care run as a branch of government. Many of us here in California are strongly in favor of this, or at least some form of single payer or universal health care. But there are others who are strongly opposed. And at the very least, in this political environment, it's one of those metonymic things that triggers culture wars and leads immediately to political quagmire. So that socialized medicine is definitely not the thing that needs to be added in. So language matters. There are many kinds of social in personalized medicine already, and many of them were represented today that are extremely interesting. I'm going to look at 5 of them now and talk a little bit about what they've done that would fall under the heading of social innovation. Genomics Inclusion, social precision in genomic categories, rare disease crowdfunding and innovation, epidemiology and public health, and health social movements. And then several of these approaches involve public engagement, and that itself, public engagement in science and biomedicine, which is itself a much contested concept. So the first one then, genomics inclusion, this would be, at the moment, is probably most represented by the NIH's program All of Us, which is aiming to sample over 1 million patients, enroll over 1 million patients that have the same degree of diversity that the general population does. And they're triangulating 3 kinds of data in particular: environmental data, biological markers, and lifestyle data for over 1 million Americans. There's an emphasis in this project on making sure that historic wrongs by which some populations were under or over-sampled, under or over-served, will be corrected, and that the database will be truly representative. So this, you could say, is what I called in my 2013 book, Good Science par excellence. That is, that the social justice criteria are better and that the science itself is better. You're going to get more accurate biological data if the representation and the social categories you use are more accurate. It addresses what's been called medical apartheid, that's Harriet Washington's phrase, and health disparities from the perspective of data and research. And it's making huge efforts to partner with data platforms, medical institutions, and community-based organizations for its recruitment. And probably many of you, just as I do, get regular mail in your inboxes about what they're doing next and what help they would like. The second kind of social innovation we're already seeing to a great extent in personalized medicine. This involves becoming far, far more accurate about the complex interactions between socially salient modern categories of peoplehood. Things like race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, ability, class, religion, citizenship, and age. Things that are very, very real in their social effects, in the health outcomes associated with them, in people's abilities to recognize and name themselves and others, in people's susceptibility to disease, violence, and so on. But they are very poorly correlated with many biological with differences in many biological systems. So getting those complex interactions much more accurate involves much greater precision. This comes against a history of excessive biological reification, that's turning things that are social categories, albeit very, very real ones, into looking for precise biological correlates for them, whereby many kinds of social difference, especially ones based on hate and discrimination and violence, have been turned into, as it were, biological, you would call them pseudo-facts or false post-fact, maybe I guess that's newer language, but pseudo-facts. And that history is a long and violent one in science and medicine, and so getting it right matters deeply. These interactions are complex, and the data will take time to approach, to accumulate and to be approached with more accuracy. The leaning on the new big data competencies is very, very promising in this arena. I think that some of the talks we heard today about the different kinds of genomes that we have within us, whether it's in our microbiome or whether it's donor-derived, should suggest as well that caution really is important in this arena. Another kind of social innovation we've seen that's been absolutely fascinating to watch has been around orphan diseases and rare diseases, and also I would add from my kind of World Health Organization background, diseases that are much more common in low resource countries where there's market failures, where the market failures is about where the market model doesn't work. So intervening with social and biomedical innovation in a research environment dominated by the market, normally dominated by market logics of economies of scale and the idea that there's a bench-to-bedside spur to innovation, that the expense of the R&D chain will eventually pay off in products that are brought to market. For all the models where that fails, the ones I've just mentioned and others, it's been incredibly important to innovate socially to do things about that. Bringing expensive practices such as whole genome sequencing to bear on rare diseases has involved combining the recognition that social justice in medicine requires striving for equity in treatment regardless of the numbers of people affected. So there's a moral economy as well. We have to see, it's quite common for people to be very, very anxious about health expenditure and about people garnering more than their share of health expenses. The affective outlook that I find the most helpful is, instead of saying, why is she getting more dollars per capita than I am, out of the total pie of healthcare expenditure, is to say how lucky I don't need as many dollars as she does. And you'd be amazed how often that thought alone, it can disrupt that pattern of thinking. But where the market model doesn't work, coming to see it as important that we have a way of bringing biomedicine to bear on rare diseases, on diseases in low-resource countries and so on, is part of what it takes to, part of the social innovation required to bring personalized medicine into these areas. It's also involved other kinds of social innovation, such as setting up innovative funding and advocacy platforms that bypass some or all of the expense and numbers of patients usually required in the R&D pipeline. I think you're beginning to hear all around that crowdsourcing has gone from being something where the local mothers of the high school want to, fundraise to get jerseys for their soccer club, to being something that is almost a valid economic model. And one of the areas where that innovation has been really importantly pioneered is around funding for people with rare diseases. Also, what do you do where you don't have the numbers to generate the data? And so being very, very proactive in starting up registries, in connecting across geographic and time zones, bringing people together in what's sometimes called biosociality, disease biosociality, has been another kind of innovation that makes it possible to do the epistemological work that you need to do to prove causality around diseases that are rare or under studied. Okay, epidemiology and public health, these are terms that are always already public in their outlook, always already collective, and sort of the opposite of personalized medicine in almost every shade of their meanings. They're much, much older. In the mother country, they go back at least to the 17th century. Some people argue they go back to ancient times. But they're primarily fields that deal with population-level health, incidence, prevalence, distribution, and control of disease as an issue of national security and productivity, things that seem to pose a risk to social order and to the body politic. So it's not really about the well-being of the collective so much as, at least historically, so much as about these state-level goals, how not to have epidemics start, how to prevent things from spreading, how to control diseases that cross borders and things like that. As most of you in this room will know, almost exactly a year ago, UCSF, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the White House partnered in what was called a Precision Public Health Summit up at UCSF, and maybe some of the people in this room were there. And that was an attempt to define precisely what it might be, or to begin to define. In the resulting report, they left it very open, but to begin to define what it might mean to bring into conversation things that are coming, capacities and approaches that are coming to fruition in personalized medicine with things that we care about a lot in public health. The major themes that came out of that summit were social justice themes to do with health equity and inclusion, and pathways to that were through data integration and data sharing. Community engagement was another ongoing theme. Environmental data collection, so again, this emphasis on, in a country like America, so you can study cancer clusters in many European countries so much more easily than you can here, because they have these mandatory, sometimes you can opt out, but there's default opt-in things where people have your medical records, where researchers, the government keeps this information, and where the idea of government knowing things about you and the idea of researchers having access to that is not as not as embattled by concerns, which I actually think are really important and serious, to do with privacy, do with healthcare funding, insurance, and healthcare portability, as they are in this country. In this country, it's far, far harder, and so our regulation tends to be much more on product, on the R&D pipeline, much more on CLIA and the laboratory certification, and then we tend to have to develop these registries, which are turning out to be really important epistemological and social tools. The fifth one that is a very important source is also an older source of social activism around healthcare that is coming into conversation increasingly with personalized medicine, but originally perhaps didn't seem obviously to fit together. And that's what get called in the social sciences health social movements, where citizens rise up, where patients collect together, where people protest ways of thinking about things, or invisibility, or ignoring of various conditions. So health social movements have been vital over the last century, so it's a newer area than epidemiology and public health, but very vital in bringing our collective attention to industrial diseases in particular, to things that are products of the way we live now, the things we do to our bodies, the fact that we postpone childbearing, the fact that we have all kinds of environmental contaminants that we're exposed to in differential amounts, and the fact that there's not a lot of oversight on the private sector parts of the development of some. Actually, that's not exactly true, but that the private sector isn't regulated in the same way that the public sector is. Health social movements have been really important in calling our collective attention to possible correlations and clusters of disease from environmental contaminants, racism in medicine, the effects of poverty, the effects of food insecurity. And I just wanted to focus on a couple of groups of scholars and activists who are really important in the intersection with personalized medicine that's beginning to come to fruition at the moment. And indigenous and critical race scholars and activists in particular have brought our attention to the underserving and oversampling of populations in health research, including in genomics. So taking a perspective that questions whether or not people should be studied has led to an enormous amount of social innovation in recent years, as well as what's the ratio between whether or not you're likely to be studied and whether or not you're likely to benefit from any clinical applications of something where your body was part of what was studied. Disability justice scholars and activists and queer and intersex and feminist scholars are groups of scholars that have brought our attention to over and under medicalization of different lives. And this is something that, again, when we jump into the personalized medicine frame, for all its wonders, it's very easy to over-medicalize. It's very easy to forget that there are very different ways of looking at things, that not everything can have or should have a cure. Not all forms of difference in embodiment are necessarily important to be cured. So the foundational slogan, if you like, or concept at the heart of disability justice approaches to healthcare, to disability, the idea that it's more important to have a social, or to start from a social model of disability, which is the idea that people do come in a variety of different embodiments, and most of the problems that people have are to do with the ways that the world caters to people who are embodied in a particular way, rather than anything that's wrong with being the person that they actually are. So if you aren't ambulatory, it's a problem that you can only get into this room by stairs. But if there's a ramp, it isn't a problem anymore. So you don't necessarily need to be cured of your non-ambulatoriness. I'm sure this is a very familiar concept to everybody in the room. But that breakthrough, that reminding ourselves that the potential to over-medicalize stays with us all the time. We also know about economic over-medicalization around the concentration of end-of-life care, and we hear report after report of physicians who would not and do not do most of the things that are on offer to end-of-life Americans. We also know about progress that's been made through social health movements to stop thinking about intersex conditions, for example, as something that necessarily needs correcting. Certainly as something that would need correcting before you're of an age to offer your own informed consent about the matter. Or things like homosexuality, why would they be thought of as being a medical condition or something that needs correcting? As we move into the era of genome editing, we think that it's very intuitive what the difference is between disease and disability, but you only have to look back through old medical textbooks, through all the documents amassed by old social movements, through former volumes of the DSM, to see that many things that we used to think were disease and debility are now seen as normal variation. We also see the exact opposite, that many things that we used to put down to character, often at enormous cost to families and individuals of stigmatization and moral censure, are now seen as being things that are much more to do with disease states or something that could be approached biomedically through, for example, personalized medicine. A prime example of this is obesity research. You cannot, if you read any of the fat positive and body aware literature, the stigma and the moral censure that goes with being considered to be overweight is enormous. It's considered that you lack control, that you eat uncontrollably, that you don't exercise, and that you're not a virtuous person. In fact, that complex of things has been shown again and again to associate with things that have absolutely nothing to do with your body shape and size. It goes into whether or not you're a good person or your family is a good person. If we begin to think of it as something that could be, for example, ameliorated with a fecal transplant, we're taking ourselves into a very, very different kind of territory that has enormous potential by medicalizing to destigmatize. So that cuts both ways, and it's really important for us to keep remembering that we have this long historical tendency to over and under medicalize, and keep asking ourselves, how can we serve one another, treat one another better by being more accurate about that. Okay. So most of these positions I've just talked about work with this newer model of public engagement in science. This concept replaced the old model. The old model was public understanding of science. Some people where I used to teach at Harvard call it the Charles River School of Science Policy, the download model where experts know everything and they tell you what you ought to think, and the only obligation they have to the public is to educate you. And once you're educated, you'll see that they're right and you'll listen to them. That was the old model of the public's role in science innovation and medical innovation. It's been really roundly and soundly replaced in most places because it's seen to have a democratic deficit and because it's seen to ignore vast numbers of other relevant expertises. So this newer idea of the public engagement of science is very contested, and it's actually really hard to do well. But it has a few characteristics. So the public engagement model holds that while experts know their own scientific fields best, they lack understanding of other people's fields. That's a change. The idea that you just because you know your own field best doesn't mean that you also can speak best about things related to that. Experts are no better or worse on average than anyone else in knowing how to think about the issues raised by the science in question for the population at large, and recognizing that the public has many areas of expertise, including other kinds of science, but also non-scientific kinds of knowledge such as law, ethics, humanities, and then their own sets of experiences that are not only relevant epistemologically, but bring funding sources, but most of all bring organizational energy. They bring the will to compete, to engage in research, and to organize socially to make things happen. So this is a or much less hierarchical model where different actors and different kinds of knowledge are important. It's much more participatory, but of course it has a democratic surfeit. Where do you end? Who do you ask? And that makes it very unruly. I personally struggle with the American version. So I sit on various committees both in the US and in the UK. And in the US, we like to name exactly what roles of people we're going to put on committees, and they're all seen as having a particular kind of relevance to bring to bear on whether or not something should be ethically approved. So I always get sort of hot under the collar about what about all the other people? What about all of their views? What about the things that people who precisely aren't stakeholders and so aren't invested in the outcome of this? What about the kind of neutrality and objectivity they would have? Where are they in this conversation? In the UK, on the other hand, the ethos is very, very different of these committees. It's this idea that there's something called the great and the good, that people who rise to a relative level of prominence in any of their fields can sit on these committees, and then they opine in this rather paternalistic way. And in the end, what you do is you consult loads and loads of people, but you don't do anything with your consultation. It's not democratic. It doesn't lead to action in any way. So an English person will go around and say, what do you think? And what do you think? And what's your opinion about what we should do on this? And then they'll say, look, we consulted with everybody. Okay, it's time now. Let's just get on and approve mitochondrial DNA IVF or whatever it might be. They don't take into account what people say, especially not critics. They have these ideas of a kind of solidarity, a triumph of common sense or good sense, which again, the elision between the moral and the epistemological is very, very deep there as it is here, but along very, very different lines. So what you get there is you get a lot of voices are taken in, but not taken into account. So it's actually in practice very, very hard. But I think we should recognize the importance of the social innovation that's gone on in shifting ourselves into this idea that we need to think bigger, we need to bring other people, we need to bring clinical, we need to bring bench scientists, basic scientists, we need to bring private sector people, government people, humanists, social scientists, not all into the same room all the time, because then we'd never get our work done. 95% of the time, we just need to be able to shut our doors and do our own work for our own audiences. But 5% of the time, we need to be vascularized with one another. We need to be really robustly sharing the knowledge that we have and collecting it. Okay. So, this takes me to the place of, so what are we going to do about this, and what's missing? What kind of social innovation is still really barely there at all, and how do we do something about putting it in place? So in 2016, a number of us formed a loose coalition called Science Fair, and the FAIR was an acronym originally. It stood for Feminist Anti-Racist Equity, and it was playing off of fairness and distributive justice, playing off of the idea of science fairs that most of us in our scientific youth had grown up participating in, and that sort of spirit of citizen engagement. And our idea was to work on models where you could ask explicitly social questions. So what I've talked about so far are ways to bring social innovation in to make the clinical and research parts of biomedical research and personalized medicine in particular better, more accurate, more consonant with different kinds of lives, more recognizing of underserving and inequality. But what I haven't talked about is how we set goals that we would like that are social and then monitor whether or not particular programs such as personalized medicine writ large or particular initiatives in personalized medicine contribute or not to that. So, for example, this is personalized medicine combined with increasingly accurate genome editing tools are leading us without question into becoming more of a selecting society. I've been taught by my English colleagues not to say eugenics. I think it's not as problematic to say eugenics in America as it is in England. But in England, if you say eugenics, people won't go on listening to you. But the idea that we begin to drift into this arena where we're selecting for some kinds of people and against other kinds of people. And there are more egregious examples of this. The attempts that are reported and about which there have been films made and things to look for intelligence genes and so on. But there are also just ruling out of bodily differences and so on that have been brought up by many groups. We have no kind of informatic infrastructure at the moment for monitoring those as goals in themselves. Health disparities, we are deeply invested, especially in California, into looking at access and affordability. We're deeply invested in the educational pipeline, and we heard that wonderful presentation from Genentech earlier about the programs with the South San Francisco schools in this regard. But what we are not asking is, now that we have this healthcare program, is sexism and racism better or worse than it was before? Has this contributed to the social goal that we're interested in? Are we in a situation where we have more, less inequality and more income equality? Do we have more people having access to elite colleges? We're not asking ourselves whether the social goals that we're interested in writ large are reached, and we're also not asking ourselves who we would like to impanel as a state, as a community, as a country, to ask those questions, to monitor them, and how they should intervene. So the central goal of Science Fair is to harness big data and health informatics platforms to monitor and intervene to correct long-term trends in population-wide social goods that are tied to health research but not couched in terms of those cures. So you cannot ask of someone or their family who is a sufferer from a particular disease, but wait, should you actually have access to that treatment, because isn't that adding to us becoming a selecting society? That's not an ethical question. That's not a grammatical question. The question is, are we as a society choosing who we want to, and if we are choosing, is that what we want to be doing, and are we doing it well according to whose criteria? What kinds of people are going to be here next year? Not, should we not let this child have access to this treatment because the broader, so we don't want to put onto the individual the population-wide concern. The population-wide concern needs its own informatics. It needs its own informatics to be tied into the rest of personalized medicine, but not in terms of its goals. It needs its own goalposts. It needs its own benchmarks. It needs its own rules of engagement and empanelment to monitor and bring those things about. I'm not a big fan of once and for all lines in the sand. I think people change, local moral worlds change, even more deontological moral precepts change in how we understand them over time. So I'm much more interested in things where there's a flexible makeup of these kinds of what we envision to be the kinds of people that would work on these infrastructures. But what we're not doing at the moment is putting any such infrastructure into place. We published a letter in Nature in October where we proposed this and they allowed us to call ourselves Science Fair as the authors, which was great, to propose something in relation to the Chan and Zuckerberg BioHub. I'll just quickly read the letter and wrap up in a minute. We have an idea for philanthropists Priscilla Chan and Mark Zuckerberg, and I was lucky enough to be at my daughter's graduation last week and heard Zuckerberg give really a very, what I thought was inspiring speech. So I do think that this is possible. Who last month announced their first major investment in basic science, $600 million for a BioHub in San Francisco, California. They aspire to advance human potential and promote equality, those are their words, As members of the Science Fair Collective, we suggest that 5 to 7% of the BioHub's health research budget, so that's taken from the range around the Human Genome Days, should be used to design and monitor goals of justice and equality from the outset. Otherwise, social inequalities could limit the project's potential. Innovative social scientists will need to work with bench scientists, engineers, and clinical researchers. Health research should include trained people from all social backgrounds and a variety of disciplines. The affordability of treatments and access to them is crucial, irrespective of class, gender, race, or disabilities. Building equality into BioHub's founding architecture will allow it to be tackled simultaneously with disease eradication, mitigating the uneven social distribution of healthcare in San Francisco's Bay Area and beyond. So this was a particular ask or challenge that we asked for. So at this point, as we gear up to our official launch, we're looking for informatic and biomedical partners to begin to implement some modest versions of this, some pilots for this. And again, returning to my original point, it's vital to act, not just to critique. So core components of social good health informatics. So what we're calling it is social good health informatics. Panels of peers selected to oversee the goals that are being monitored with community-based primacy, government buy-in, health infrastructure and data analytics buy-in, robust, regularly updated measures of increased well-being, march-in rights, that's from intellectual property language, but that's just a shorthand for the idea that you need to have some teeth. You need to be able to do something about it. If it turns out that we pursue one avenue and then we ignore prevention, we ignore education, we ignore food security, we ignore issues that are more important to well-being by going down a particular route that addresses personalized medicine. So march-in rights to call for new research or tweaks in ongoing research in the light of findings, robust and ongoing public consultation, and funding models that internalize heretofore health externalities that are relevant to the broader questions of healthcare, well-being, and social good distribution. Thank you again for your attention. With this particular project, we're really interested in things that are expressed as big social problems. So things that are over-medicalization and under-medicalization, well-being, not just in terms of disease incidence and prevalence, cures, but also care, also aspects of funding decisions, aspects of ways one can live one's life that come to bear with different patterns of treatment and disease. So in the case of the rare diseases, I think the focus really, I believe that you heard a presentation on this morning, and I think the focus there really has to be on this aspect of how do you bring funding models and infrastructure into being where you can't lean on market models. And one of the components of that is or even if you can eventually make it economically profitable. And one of the components of that, as I said, I do think is an ethical and a social good issue, which is thinking about it not in terms of, oh, that person's getting more than me, or oh, that we can't waste our dollars on that. We've got to do healthcare rationing, but thinking of it in terms of how do we bring different economic models to bear? How do we bring different kinds of innovation to bear, so that doesn't cauterize a particular line of research? So I think that that's the kind of pathway that seems most fruitful to me around the rare diseases, and we have many wonderful examples of that in the patient advocacy community and its infrastructure and startup capacity. Yes.
Can you tell us who's getting involved in this social good health informatics and who you're looking for and who can get involved?
So we're really interested in partnering with one or some several health infrastructures that are just being set up right now, so that we can get something in place that's from the ground up, where community members and the relevant experts for these social goals are empaneled from the get-go, and I mean literally. So one of the things that I've written about is science building architecture. It's really, really interesting to me, and I think it's really important. But also the model systems that are used, the economic models that are used, and start from the ground up to, in the same way that you might choose Huntington's, you might choose some forms of blindness, you might pick some medical targets, you also would pick one or two social targets, qua-social targets, that are really important to your local area, that the people in your local area historically and at the moment, and we've heard today about the difference, the kinds of haves and have-nots educationally in this area that the Genentech program is out to address. So that would be an example. That kind of inequality would be an example of something that might have great purchase here. Then setting benchmarks from the get-go around inequality as we build up healthcare infrastructure, so that it doesn't fall on the shoulders of individual people, but by turning to personalized medicine, we also don't lose sight of those social dynamics. With respect to health. Thank you. Yes.
So the public engagement in science is a great concept.
Yes.
But my question is related to the public understanding of science,
Yeah.
or misunderstanding of science. Is definitely the big issue there. So how
Yeah.
can we actually get in the engagement really into that kind of understanding or correct those misunderstandings?
Yeah, so I think that there are only some, and of course it's not just lay public's misunderstandings or non-understanding of science that's a problem, but people in specific fields of science have been shown in testing conditions to have appalling understanding of one another's subfields. So at this point, we have such specialized knowledge and such specialized infrastructures, and growing, that specificity is growing exponentially as we have more informatic infrastructure and using machine learning and things more and more. That deficit between what any one person understands and the total that's out there to be understood gets bigger and bigger. So it's certainly not that that's going away. But we have in general a crisis of not just of that misunderstanding across the board. So it's true of scientists of one another as well as the public of science, of understanding of science. It's also true of all other fields of research. So we have incredibly sophisticated knowledge now about patterns of comparative racialization, for example, about the correlations with race and gender and class and health outcomes. We have incredible knowledge about different ethical systems that people in different cultures use as their touchstones and how they're combined, but we have appalling general understanding. The general members of the public do not understand one another. On the one hand, that's fantastic because we've got this modern division of labor, and we're each doing our thing, and we're each our cog in a wheel that's much greater than the sum of its parts. And again, I think in the quote-unquote fourth industrial revolution, that's going to take off exponentially, that none of us will understand. But then we are left with the question of who and what are we, and how do we put any human values back into the system? How do we say who should know what? And who is a person and what matters if we get to the point where, relative to our best technology, everything is dominated by machine learning, everything is dominated by informatics, that each one of us just doesn't know enough about anything? What world are we living in? So I think it's a very different kind of crisis, but it is a crisis, and people are talking all the time about the populism crisis, that government, which certainly in America in the post-war period, science and technology have had an incredibly tight relationship with government, and not quite to the point of technocracy, but certainly to the point that it has been assumed that there's an isomorphism between what makes good science and what makes good government, and that's split apart in the current rise of populism. We have better science and technology than we've ever had before, And we have a political system that disregards that. It's not just STEM fields, it's also all the social science fields and things, and indeed, in some ways, the social science fields are under even greater onslaught, because you can just say, oh, if you use any knowledge based on your knowledge of race or gender or sexuality or poverty, then you're just being PC and you're stopping my free speech. So not only is your knowledge completely negated, but you've been called out as being someone who's going against the democratic values of a modern state. So in some ways, the social sciences are in even worse danger at the moment. They are, of course, somewhat to blame. There's a kind of moral centering and a moral censoring where people like to call out, oh, you didn't know that, you were racist, sexist, or whatever, that I think just has to stop. What we say in our fields is we need to call people in. Everybody comes from where they come from, and it's not about showing someone that they're wrong, it's about all going somewhere better together. But we really do have those multiple 3 layers of knowledge crises, I would say, just to agree with you.
So are you particularly worried that all the progress we're talking about will be derailed in the next couple of years?
Rather than yesterday. I have some hope. Is that enough? I have some hope around a few things. I'm a huge technophile, and I have a long interest in artificial intelligence and machine learning. As the first member of the Oxford Artificial Intelligence Society back in the 1980s, I think that there's a huge danger. We ain't seen nothing yet. We don't know what we're going to have in 6 months, let alone in a couple of years. But I also think it's extraordinarily exciting, and we may, people are really worried about autonomous weapons, and with great good reason, I think. But they're worried about, us not, but about machines being able to override their off switches and not serve humans anymore. But sometimes, like yesterday, we want to override that human capacity to switch off. So I have some hope that in these technologies, I definitely have the sense that, and with personalized medicine too, I have some hope that we will get much better social accuracy and stop all those heinous aspects that we have this long, deep, violent history around the intersection between the social and the biological. But I do think these are really, really risky times, and I do think that that it's non-obvious that one way to keep, whether or not democracy is the right model, I don't know, but one way to keep democracy and knowledge running together is through science and technology. Now that they've split apart, it's not clear where truth, facts, knowledge fit into governance anymore, and the entropy is just toward authoritarianism, and toward unbridled hate, and I don't see. At the moment, we don't have good models to bring that together. So I think the job is to knit those two back together in some productive way. I think the private sector has a huge role. If we say, well, the government's just one thing, and maybe we don't need to think of bench to bedside as a unidirectional thing where the public pays for the initial phase of research and it assumes all the risk, and then everyone who participates is a donor and gives freely, and value only accrues to ownership further down the line and further up the R&D chain. If we can shift those models a little bit, if we can give the private sector a bigger role in social responsibility, not just as vanity projects, not just as kind of what to do with the excess capital you accumulate, but from the get-go, we could do something really good and important, but your guess is as good as, maybe better than mine. But yeah, scary times.
Did I see one more question?
Well, I mean, one of the things that with these panels that you have is
Yeah.
great, but what happens when you have how you truly going to get everyone with all these, you know, and I do believe we are,
Yeah.
we have that strength when we all participate.
Yeah.
But like our democracy, we don't necessarily all participate.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's one of the things we're spending the most time on at the moment is this algorithmic triage or algorithmic filtering, bubble chambers, echo chambers. The fact that the technologies that we have at the moment have turned us into, there is no such thing as a shared demos anymore, and they've turned us into these very, very partisan, very separated. Partly it's through lack of imagination technically. I mean, so much of what we're doing digitally and algorithmically is based on homophily. That doesn't have to be. We can change that overnight. But one of the reasons why I really love history, just to be a history nerd for a second, is that there are certain, in different countries, different things trigger people. And so one way to get innovation around stem cells for example, in the US is to broker solutions that don't involve anybody thinking that you're engaging in the mass slaughter of embryos. You don't have to do that in other countries, but other issues are the problem. Like in the UK, animal rights are really, really important. So being able to see historically both what are the capacities that lurk within a particular culture, what are the things that we can come together on, and what are the things where we just can't, that they're too toxic right now to be fit for use. What are the building blocks we can use that are, as it were, in the governmental repertoire of a culture, but aren't too toxic to use at the moment, and how do we bring those to bear? But as I said, it's an unruly business. It's very, very imperfect. Bringing people who have no stake to the table is really hard, because why would they come? And we know from internet trolls and so on and so forth that we've talked ourselves into a place where by far the loudest voices anyone is hearing are the ones at the political extremes. So absolutely, it's a huge problem. But starting from the social issue, and then asking in that community, who are the people working on it? So doing something that's quite bottom up can sometimes be a really good practical route to go as well. So if people agree that housing prices are a problem in the Bay Area, starting from that perspective and working up from there, rather than saying we hate experts, or we want to nuke Silicon Valley and go back to coal or whatever it is, rather than saying that we're going to innovate our way out of absolutely every social issue there ever was, rather than having those extremes. Starting from what does it look like to do something about local inequality, about housing prices, and what are all the intimate and integral ways in which that connects? As we know, most people who go bankrupt do so because of medical bills at the moment. So there's a deep, deep connection between medicine and inequality. There are things so starting really practically can often defuse that. But I think impaneling the right people, having it fluid, and having face-to-face still is really important, but not easy.